The stunningly beautiful Bajoran female, Sirius, never imagined a human soldier would be her salvation. As laser fire peppered the bridge of the Bajoran transport ship, she watched in disbelief as Sergeant Scott Crawford, a human she'd never met, fought his way through the pirate-infested corridors to reach her and the other hostages. The attack had come swiftly and without warning. One moment, the transport ship carrying important Bajoran dignitaries and civilians cruised peacefully through a remote sector of the galaxy. The next, ruthless space pirates swarmed the vessel, overwhelming its defenses and taking control. As the pirates boarded, the ship's distress call echoed through space. By sheer chance, a human military vessel intercepted the transmission. Aboard that ship, Sergeant Scott Crawford's muscles tensed as he listened to the desperate pleas for help. The ship's captain, bound by regulations against interfering in alien conflicts, ordered the crew to stand down. But Scott couldn't ignore the call. In a daring act of disobedience, he slipped away from his post and commandeered an escape pod. With a determined set to his jaw, he launched himself towards the besieged Bajoran ship. The human's superior combat training became evident as soon as he touched down. Scott moved with lethal efficiency, his strength and agility allowing him to overpower alien attackers twice his size. He fought his way through the ship's winding corridors, leaving a trail of unconscious pirates in his wake. When Scott burst onto the bridge, the scene before him was grim. A group of Bajoran hostages huddled together, fear etched on their faces. Among them stood Sirius, her ethereal beauty a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding her. The lead pirate, a hulking creature with mottled green skin, pressed an energy weapon to a hostage's head. "Surrender, human," the pirate growled, "or watch them die." Scott's mind raced, assessing the situation in seconds. With a move too fast for the aliens to track, he disarmed the lead pirate and created a diversion. "Run!" he shouted to the hostages, who didn't need to be told twice. As they fled, a pirate's energy weapon discharged, catching Sirius in the leg. Without hesitation, Scott scooped her into his arms. He ran through the ship's corridors, cradling Sirius against his chest while fending off pursuers with his free hand. They reached the escape pod bay just as alarms blared throughout the ship. The pirate vessel was set to self-destruct. Scott gently placed Sirius in a pod, then turned to face the oncoming pirates one last time. With a flurry of punches and kicks, he cleared a path back to the pod. He leapt in beside Sirius and punched the launch sequence. As they drifted in the vastness of space, waiting for rescue, Sirius turned her luminous eyes to Scott. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you risk everything for us? For me?" Scott met her gaze steadily. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. Sirius shook her head in wonder. Her own people's security forces had failed, yet this human she'd never met before had risked everything to save her. As the reality of what had transpired sank in, Sirius realized this was only the beginning. This event would spark a complex relationship between her and Scott, filled with cultural misunderstandings, interspecies attraction, and potential conflict with both human and Bajoran authorities. But for now, as they floated in the silent expanse of space, Sirius could only marvel at the bravery of the human soldier who had dared to save her. The escape pod drifted silently through the vastness of space, its two occupants acutely aware of their precarious situation. Sirius winced as Scott gently examined her injured leg, his fingers probing the energy weapon burn with practiced efficiency. "This might sting a bit," Scott warned, reaching for the pod's medical kit. He extracted a small vial of antiseptic and began cleaning the wound. Sirius bit her lip, suppressing a gasp of pain. "You're quite skilled at this," she observed, watching him work. Scott shrugged, his focus unwavering. "Basic field medicine. Every soldier learns it." As he wrapped a bandage around her leg, Sirius became increasingly aware of their close proximity. The pod's cramped interior left little room for personal space, and she could feel the warmth radiating from Scott's body. Hours ticked by, the silence broken only by the occasional beep of the pod's systems. Suddenly, an alarm blared, red warning lights flashing across the control panel. "Life support's failing," Scott muttered, his brow furrowing as he studied the readouts. Without hesitation, he pried open an access panel and began rerouting power conduits. Sirius watched in fascination as Scott's hands moved with swift precision, connecting wires and adjusting circuits. "How did you learn to do that?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Necessity," Scott replied, not looking up from his work. "When you're in the field, you learn to improvise or die." The alarm ceased and Scott sat back with a satisfied nod. That should buy us a few more hours. Sirius found herself reassessing the human soldier. In Bajoran society, such practical skills were often overlooked in favor of intellectual pursuits. Yet Scott's ability to adapt and overcome challenges was undeniably impressive. Their moment of relief was short-lived. The pod suddenly lurched, caught in the gravitational pull of a nearby planet. Scott's hands flew over the controls. His face hardened in concentration as he fought to stabilize their descent. "Hang on," he ordered, gripping the navigation stick with white-knuckled intensity. "This is going to be rough." The pod shuddered violently as it entered the planet's atmosphere, heat building around its exterior. Scott's piloting skills were put to the test as he maneuvered through turbulent air currents, fighting for control. With a bone-jarring impact, the pod crashed onto the planet's surface, skidding across rocky terrain before coming to a halt. For a moment, silence reigned. Then Scott stirred, shaking his head to clear it. "You okay?" he asked, turning to Sirius. She nodded, her eyes wide with shock. "Where are we?" Scott activated the pod's sensors, scanning their surroundings. "Tarek 3, he read from the display. "Barely habitable. We need to get out of here and assess the situation." They emerged from the battered pod into a harsh, alien landscape. Towering rock formations stretched towards a red-tinged sky, while sparse, twisted vegetation dotted the barren ground. The air was hot and dry, sapping moisture from their skin. Scott wasted no time. He salvaged what supplies he could from the pod, then set about constructing a makeshift shelter using debris and the local terrain. Sirius watched in admiration as he worked tirelessly, her own leg injury limiting her ability to help. As the alien sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted. Scott and Sirius huddled together in their shelter, the proximity both necessary and increasingly charged with unspoken tension. "Tell me about Bajor," Scott said, breaking the silence. "What's it like?" Sirius's eyes lit up as she spoke of her homeworld, describing its lush landscapes and rich cultural heritage. In turn, Scott shared stories of Earth and his military career, painting a picture of a world vastly different from her own. Morning brought new challenges. "We need water," Scott announced, fashioning crude tools from pod wreckage. "Can you walk?" Sirius nodded, gritting her teeth against the pain in her leg. They set out across the alien terrain, Scott's eyes constantly scanning for threats or resources. Their search led them to a network of underground caves. Cool air wafted from the entrance, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat above. Inside, they discovered a small freshwater spring, its clear waters a welcome sight. As they refilled their makeshift canteens, a chittering sound echoed through the cave. Scott tensed, positioning himself protectively in front of Sirius. From the shadows emerged a group of large insectoid creatures, their mandibles clicking menacingly. Scott's combat training kicked in. He dodged the first creature's lunge, delivering a precise strike that sent it reeling. But there were too many to fight off alone. "Wait!" Sirius called out, her diplomatic instincts taking over. She observed the insects' movements, noting patterns in their clicks and gestures. Slowly, deliberately, she mimicked one of their non-aggressive postures. The effect was immediate. The creatures paused, their antennae twitching curiously. Sirius continued her improvised communication, and gradually the hostility drained from the air. Scott watched in amazement as Sirius effectively negotiated a truce with the alien insects. Her intellect and empathy had achieved what his combat skills could not. As they emerged from the caves, Scott and Sirius shared a look of newfound respect and understanding. Their shared ordeal had forged a bond between them, bridging the gap between their different worlds and experiences. Days passed and their reliance on each other deepened. Scott's practical skills ensured their survival, while Sirius's insight and diplomacy helped them navigate the alien environment. They found themselves growing closer, stolen glances and lingering touches, hinting at feelings neither dared to voice. Their time on Tarak III came to an abrupt end when the distinctive hum of a spacecraft broke the alien world's silence. A sleek vessel descended from the sky, bearing the insignia of a joint human-Bajoran fleet. As the rescue team approached, led by a stern-faced man Scott recognized as Commander John Reeves, reality came crashing back. The bubble of intimacy that had formed around Scott and Sirius during their time on the planet began to dissipate. "Sergeant Crawford," Commander Reeves called out, his voice a mixture of relief and disapproval. "You have a lot of explaining to do." Scott and Sirius exchanged a final loaded glance before being ushered into separate debriefing areas. As the doors closed between them, both were left wondering what the future held for their newfound connection and how it would fare in the face of duty, cultural differences, and the complexities of their respective worlds. Worlds and experiences. As the rescue ship touched down, the stark reality of their situation came crashing back. Commander John Reeves strode towards them, his face a mask of stern authority. "Sergeant Crawford," he called out, his tone a mixture of relief and disapproval. "You have a lot of explaining to do." Scott and Sirius exchanged a final loaded glance before being ushered into separate debriefing areas. The doors closed between them with a soft hiss, leaving each to face the consequences of their shared ordeal alone. Aboard the USS Intrepid, Scott found himself standing at attention before Admiral Marcus Adams, the fluorescent lights of the briefing room casting harsh shadows across the older man's face. "Sergeant Crawford," Admiral Adams began, his voice carefully neutral, "explain your actions during the Bajoran ship rescue." Scott recounted the events with military precision, his voice steady as he described the pirate attack, his decision to disobey orders, and the subsequent rescue operation. He didn't flinch as he detailed their crash landing on Tarak III and the challenges they faced on the alien world. "Sir, I stand by my decision," Scott concluded, meeting the Admiral's gaze. "Those hostages needed help, and I was in a position to provide it." Admiral Adams leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You understand the gravity of your actions, Sergeant? The potential diplomatic ramifications?" "Yes, sir," Scott replied, his lips pursed. "But I believe saving innocent lives transcends political boundaries." Meanwhile, on the Bajoran ship Celestial Temple, Sirius sat before a panel of her people's officials. Her injured leg carefully elevated, she recounted her own version of events, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and gratitude as she described Scott's actions. "Without Sergeant Crawford's intervention, I wouldn't be here," Sirius stated, her eyes shining with conviction. "His courage and resourcefulness saved not just my life, but the lives of all the hostages." The Bajoran officials exchanged glances, their expressions a blend of admiration and concern. One of them, a silver-haired woman named Minister Lyra, leaned forward. "We are, of course, grateful for the sergeant's actions," she said carefully. "However, we must consider the implications of human military involvement in Bajoran affairs." As the debriefings continued on both ships, a tense atmosphere settled over the small fleet. Human and Bajoran officials engaged in heated discussions, their voices carrying through the corridors of their respective vessels. The diplomatic strain was palpable when suddenly alarms blared across both ships. Red alert lights bathed the corridors in an eerie glow as crew members rushed to their stations. On the bridge of the USS Intrepid, Admiral Adams received the urgent report. "Sir, multiple hostile ships detected. It's the pirates. They're back, and in greater numbers." Across space on the Celestial Temple, Minister Lyra's face paled as she received similar news. "By the prophets," she whispered, "they've come for revenge." The pirate fleet, led by the imposing warship of Captain Zorn, emerged from warp space with weapons charged. The sudden attack caught both the human and Bajoran vessels off guard, forcing them to scramble into defensive positions. Scott, hearing the alarms, instinctively moved towards the nearest weapon station. Admiral Adams, seeing the sergeant's reaction, made a split-second decision. "Crawford, take command of Red Squadron," he ordered. "Let's see if your improvisation skills work as well in space as they did on that planet." Scott snapped a salute and raced to the fighter bay. Within minutes, he was strapped into the cockpit of a sleek human fighter, leading a squadron out into the chaotic space battle. On the Celestial Temple, Sirius limped to the bridge, her face set with purpose. "Minister," she called out, "let me help coordinate our efforts with the human ship. We stand a better chance if we work together." Minister Lara hesitated only for a moment before nodding her assent. Sirius immediately set to work, her hands flying over the communication console as she established a direct link with the USS Intrepid. In space, Scott's voice crackled over the comm systems of both ships as he led his squadron in a daring attack run. "Red Squadron, form up on me. We're going to thread the needle between those two cruisers." His fighters wove through the battlefield with precision, their weapons finding vulnerable points on the pirate ships. On the bridges of both Allied vessels, human and Bajoran crew members watched in awe as the tide of battle began to turn. Suddenly, Captain Zorn's massive warship broke through the defensive line, bearing down on the Celestial Temple. Scott's eyes narrowed as he saw the danger. "Red Squadron, new objective," he barked into his comm. "We're going after the big one." Scott pushed his fighter to its limits, plasma bolts streaking past his cockpit as he engaged in a high-speed duel with Zorn's ship. The two vessels danced through debris fields, each pilot seeking to outmaneuver the other. In a heart-stopping moment, Scott's fighter took a glancing hit, sending it into a spin, but the human pilot recovered, using the momentum to swing around behind Zorn's ship. With a fierce grin, Scott locked onto a critical weak point and fired. The resulting explosion rocked Zorn's ship, disabling its main weapons and engines. As the pirate vessel drifted, powerless, the remaining pirate ships began to scatter. "After them!" Scott commanded, leading the pursuit to drive the pirates from the sector. In the aftermath of the battle, Scott's fighter limped back to the USS Intrepid. As he climbed out of the cockpit, still buzzing with adrenaline, he found himself face to face with Admiral Adams. "Sergeant Crawford," the Admiral said, his voice gruff but tinged with respect, "it seems we owe you a debt of gratitude. Again." Before Scott could respond, a familiar voice called out from across the hangar bay, "Scott!" He turned to see Sirius making her way towards him, supported by a Bajoran aide. Their eyes met, and for a moment the rest of the world faded away. As they drew closer, however, the reality of their situation reasserted itself. The challenges they faced, cultural differences, political tensions, and the looming threat of the defeated but not destroyed pirates, hung between them like an invisible barrier. Scott opened his mouth to speak, but a sudden commotion interrupted him. A junior officer rushed up to Admiral Adams, his face pale. "Sir," the officer reported breathlessly, "we've just intercepted a transmission from a pirate escape pod. It's Captain Zorn. He's issuing a threat." Scott and Sirius exchanged a look of concern as Admiral Adams listened to the message. The Admiral's expression darkened. "It seems," he said gravely, turning to face Scott and Sirius, "that this isn't over yet. Captain Zorn has sworn vengeance against both of you personally." The weight of this new threat settled over them, adding another layer of complexity to their already complicated situation. As they stood there in the hangar bay, surrounded by the aftermath of battle, Scott and Sirius realized that their shared adventure was far from concluded. The stars visible through the hangar bay's force field seemed to twinkle with both promise and warning, a fitting backdrop to the uncertain future that lay ahead of them. The hangar bay fell silent as Admiral Adams' words hung in the air. Scott and Sirius exchanged a glance, their newfound connection tested by the weight of Zorn's threat. Before they could process this new development, a tall Bajoran official strode into the hangar, his ornate robes swishing as he walked. He was flanked by two human officers, their crisp uniforms a stark contrast to the post-battle disarray around them. "Admiral Adams," the Bajoran official called out, his voice carrying across the bay, "I am Minister Corral. We need to discuss our next steps." Adams nodded, gesturing for Scott and Sirius to follow as they moved to a nearby briefing room. The group gathered around a large holographic display, tension palpable in the air. Minister Corral spoke first, his eyes scanning the room. "The threat posed by Zorn and his pirates cannot be ignored. We propose a joint task force to hunt them down and bring them to justice." Admiral Adams leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Agreed. We'll need our best people on this." he turned to Scott. "Sergeant Crawford, I'm appointing you as lead tactical officer for this mission." Scott straightened, surprise evident on his face. "Sir, I'm honored, but—" "No buts, Sergeant," Adams cut him off. "Your actions on Tarek 3 and in the recent battle have proven your worth." Minister Coral nodded in agreement. "And Sirius," he said, turning to the Bajoran woman, "we'd like you to serve as the diplomatic liaison between our peoples for this task force." Sirius's eyes widened, darting between the minister and Scott. "Yes, of course," she said, her voice steady despite the sudden responsibility placed on her shoulders. As the meeting continued, plans were laid out for the joint task force. Ships were allocated, crews assigned, and a strategy began to take shape. Throughout the discussion, Scott and Sirius found themselves gravitating towards each other, their shared experiences creating an invisible bond. Days blurred into weeks as the task force set out in pursuit of Zorn. They followed a trail of destruction across the sector, always one step behind the elusive pirate captain. On the bridge of the lead ship, the USS Venture, Scott pored over tactical displays, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sirius stood nearby, relaying information between the human and Bajoran crew members. "Another outpost hit," Scott muttered, updating the map. "He's not following any predictable pattern." Sirius leaned in, her shoulder brushing against his as she studied the display. "Look at the timing of these attacks," she said, pointing to a series of data points. "There's a rhythm to it, like a Bajoran prayer cycle." Scott's eyes lit up with understanding. "You're right. If we extrapolate based on this pattern—" His fingers flew over the controls, projecting a possible course. "There," Sirius said, pointing to a small, uninhabited planet. "That's where he'll strike next." Scott turned to the ship's captain, relaying their findings. Within minutes, the task force altered course, hoping to finally catch up to their quarry. As they approached the planet, tension mounted on the bridge. Scott manned the weapons station, his hands hovering over the controls. Sirius stood by the communications array, ready to intercept any transmissions. Suddenly, the ship rocked violently. Alarms blared as the tactical display lit up with multiple hostile signals. "It's an ambush," Scott shouted, already targeting the nearest enemy ship. "Zorn must have guessed we'd figure out his pattern." The space around them erupted into chaos as the task force engaged Zorn's pirate fleet. Scott coordinated the defense, his voice calm and steady as he issued orders to the fighter squadrons. Sirius worked frantically at her station, decoding intercepted communications. "Scott," she called out, "they're using a new type of jamming technology. I can't break through." Without hesitation, Scott left his post, rushing to Sirius's side. Together, they worked to decipher the complex algorithms, their hands moving in concert across the control panel. "There!" Sirius exclaimed as the jamming signal weakened. "We've got them!" With the pirates' communications exposed, the tide of battle quickly turned. Scott returned to tactical, using the newly acquired information to devastating effect. As the last pirate ship fled, a cheer went up on the bridge. Scott and Sirius shared a triumphant smile, the thrill of their shared victory evident in their eyes. But their celebration was short-lived. A priority message came through, its contents casting a pall over the bridge. "Zorn's acquired a weapon," the captain announced, his voice grave. "Something called the Stellar Forge. Intel says it can destroy entire star systems." Scott and Sirius exchanged a look of dedication. They knew the real challenge was just beginning, and the fate of countless lives now rested in their hands. Scott and Sirius exchanged a determined glance, the weight of their new mission settling upon them. Without a word, they left the bridge and headed to the shuttle bay. As they boarded a small, stealthy craft, Scott ran through the pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency. "We're entering uncharted territory," Sirius said, her voice low as she studied the navigational data. "Zorn's base is hidden in a system with dense stellar debris. It won't be easy to approach undetected." Scott's hands moved deftly over the controls. "Then we'll have to be better than easy," he replied, his focus unwavering as the shuttle slipped out of the bay and into the vast expanse of space. The journey was tense, filled with near misses as they navigated through fields of asteroids and space junk. Scott's piloting skills were put to the test, and more than once, Sirius found herself holding her breath as they squeezed through gaps that seemed impossibly narrow. As they approached the planet housing Zorn's base, Scott brought the shuttle down in a small clearing several kilometers from their target. The moment they stepped out, they were engulfed by a dense alien forest. Towering plants with bioluminescent fronds cast an eerie glow over the landscape. "Watch your step," Scott warned, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar terrain. "We don't know what kind of dangers this vegetation might hide." They moved cautiously through the underbrush, Scott taking point while Sirius kept an eye on their portable scanner. The air was thick with an unfamiliar, sweet scent that made their heads swim. Suddenly, a vine-like tendril whipped out from a nearby tree, wrapping itself around Sirius's ankle. She let out a startled cry as it began to drag her towards a gaping maw hidden among the foliage. "Sirius!" Scott shouted, his hand flying to his belt. In one fluid motion, he unsheathed a vibroblade and sliced through the vine. Sirius scrambled backward, her eyes wide with shock. Scott helped her to her feet, his hand lingering on her arm. "You okay?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Sirius nodded, her breath coming in short gasps. "Thanks to you," she replied, meeting his gaze. For a moment they stood there, the danger of their situation bringing their connection into sharp focus. As they continued their trek, they moved closer together, watching each other's backs. The shared peril seemed to strengthen their bond, their movements becoming more synchronized with each step. Finally, they reached the edge of the forest. Before them lay Zorn's compound, a sprawling complex of metal and energy shields. In the center, a massive structure loomed, the Stellar Forge. Even from this distance, they could feel the thrum of its power. Scott pulled out a pair of high-tech binoculars, scanning the perimeter. "Heavy security," he muttered. "Automated turrets, energy fences, and patrol drones. But there's a pattern to it." Sirius, meanwhile, had set up a compact communications array. Her fingers flew over the controls as she intercepted and decoded transmissions. "I'm picking up chatter about shift changes and security protocols," she reported. "If we time it right, we might find a window." They spent the next hour formulating their plan. Scott's tactical expertise meshed seamlessly with Sirius's technical knowledge, each filling in the gaps in the other's understanding. "The main gate is our best bet for a distraction," Scott said, pointing to a holographic layout of the base. "I can use the salvaged explosives from our shuttle to create chaos, draw their forces away." Sirius nodded, then indicated a small access point on the opposite side of the compound. "While you do that, I can slip in through this maintenance tunnel. Their internal systems are similar to Bajoran technology. I should be able to bypass their security." As the twin suns of the alien world began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, Scott and Sirius prepared for their infiltration. The gravity of their mission hung heavy in the air between them. Scott checked his weapons one last time, then turned to Sirius. Their eyes met, and 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. The dangers ahead, the possibility that this could be their last moment together, it all crystallized in that silent exchange. Sirius reached out, her hand grasping Scott's arm. "Be careful," she said softly. Scott nodded, his mind focused. "You too. I'll see you on the other side." With that, they parted ways. Scott moved towards the main gate, his form soon swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Sirius watched him go, then turned towards her own objective, steeling herself for what lay ahead. Scott approached the main gate, his mind focused and his body tense. He could see the guards patrolling, their weapons at the ready. Taking a deep breath, he primed the first explosive and threw it with precision. The blast rocked the compound, alarms immediately blaring to life. As guards rushed towards the gate, Scott sprang into action. He moved like a shadow, taking down 2 guards before they even realized he was there. More pirates poured out of the compound, and Scott found himself in the fight of his life. He ducked, rolled, and struck with lightning speed, his combat training coming to the fore. Each movement was calculated, each strike precise. On the other side of the compound, Sirius slipped into the maintenance tunnel, her heart pounding. She navigated the cramped space, her fingers dancing over alien control panels as she bypassed security measures. As she emerged into a dimly lit corridor, she overheard 2 guards talking. Her blood ran cold as she caught snippets of their conversation. "Zorn's really going to do it," one said. "Test the stellar forge on that populated world." "When?" the other asked. "Within the hour. He says it'll send a message to the entire sector." Sirius's mind raced. They had even less time than they'd thought. She had to find Scott and get to the control room before it was too late. Meanwhile, Scott had depleted his ammunition and was now fighting hand-to-hand. He took a glancing blow to the ribs, wincing as he felt something crack. But he pushed through the pain, his thoughts on Sirius and their mission driving him forward. As he fought his way deeper into the compound, he could hear the sounds of battle fading behind him. His diversion had worked. Now he just had to find Sirius and complete their mission. Rounding a corner, he nearly collided with her. They both raised their weapons before recognition set in. "Scott!" Sirius exclaimed, relief evident in her voice. "We need to hurry. Zorn's planning to test the stellar forge within the hour." Scott nodded grimly. "Then let's move." They made their way towards the heart of the compound. Scott's combat skills and Sirius's technical knowledge allowing them to overcome each obstacle they encountered. As they approached a heavily guarded section, they were forced to take cover as energy bolts sizzled past them. "Zorn's personal guards," Scott growled, peeking around the corner. "They're not going to make this easy." The ensuing firefight was intense. Scott and Sirius moved in perfect sync, covering each other as they advanced. At one point, an energy bolt grazed Sirius's arm. Without hesitation, Scott threw himself in front of her, using his body as a shield. The selfless act didn't go unnoticed by Sirius. As they caught their breath in a moment of relative calm, she touched his arm. "Just like when we first met," she said softly. Scott met her gaze, a hint of a smile on his lips despite the dire situation. "Some things don't change," he replied. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of slow clapping. They whirled around to see Lieutenant Marcus Graves step out of the shadows, a sneer on his face and a weapon in his hand. "Well, well," Graves said, his voice dripping with contempt. "The dynamic duo. I must say, you've led us on quite a chase." Scott's eyes narrowed. "Graves, what are you doing here?" The lieutenant's sneer widened. "Isn't it obvious? I'm with Zorn. Have been from the start." Sirius gasped. "You're the mole. That's how Zorn always stayed one step ahead." Graves nodded, his weapon trained on them. "Humans should be ruling the galaxy, not playing nice with aliens," he spat. "Zorn understands that. With the Stellar Forge, we'll finally be able to put the lesser races in their place." Scott took a step forward, his hands raised. "Think about what you're saying, Graves. This isn't what humanity stands for. We're better than this." Sirius joined in, her diplomatic skills coming to the fore. "Your ideology is based on fear and ignorance. Look at what Scott and I have accomplished together. Our differences make us stronger, not weaker." For a moment, doubt flickered in Graves's eyes, but then his expression hardened. "Save your breath. You're too late anyway. Zorn is already—" In that split second of distraction, Scott moved. With lightning speed, he closed the distance between them, knocking the weapon from Graves's hand. But even as he subdued the traitor, an alarm began to blare throughout the compound. Graves laughed bitterly. "You're done for now. The whole base knows you're here." Over the intercom, they heard Zorn's voice, filled with malicious glee. "Intruders detected, but it matters not. The Stellar Forge is ready. Witness the dawn of a new era." Scott and Sirius exchanged a look of unshakable focus. They were out of time. Leaving the unconscious Graves, they raced towards the control room, knowing that the fate of countless lives now hung in the balance. As they approached the final stretch, they skidded to a halt. Before them lay a gauntlet of pulsing energy barriers, each one promising instant death to anyone who touched it. "Zorn's last line of defense," Sirius breathed, her eyes scanning the deadly obstacle course. Scott studied the shifting patterns of energy, his tactical mind already formulating a plan. "We can do this," he said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "Together." They shared a look, drawing strength from each other. Then with a nod, they stepped forward to face the challenge that stood between them and the salvation of innocent worlds. Lives. Scott and Sirius faced the pulsing energy barriers, their eyes scanning the deadly maze before them. The air crackled with power, each barrier promising instant death to anyone who dared touch it. "I've never seen anything like this," Sirius whispered, her voice tight with tension. Scott's eyes narrowed as he studied the shifting patterns. "There's a rhythm to it. We can make it through, but it'll take perfect timing." He took a deep breath, then launched himself forward. With acrobatic grace, he twisted and rolled between the gaps in the energy fields. Sirius watched, her heart in her throat, as Scott narrowly avoided death with each move. As Scott reached a temporary safe zone, he called back, "Your turn. I'll guide you through." Sirius steeled herself and stepped forward. Following Scott's instructions, she navigated the first few barriers. Suddenly, an energy field pulsed unexpectedly. Scott's warning shout came just in time for Sirius to throw herself backward, the heat of the barrier singeing her hair. "Sirius!" Scott's voice was filled with concern. "I'm okay," she called back, her breath coming in short gasps. "But we need another way." Her eyes fell on a nearby control panel. In a flash of inspiration, she pulled out her datapad and connected it to the system. Her fingers flew over the keys as she worked to hack into the base's security protocols. "Scott, I think I can disable sections of the gauntlet, but it won't last long. When I give the signal, run." Scott nodded, tensing for action. Sirius's hack worked its magic, creating a temporary path through the energy maze. They sprinted forward, the barriers flickering back to life mere seconds after they passed. As they neared the end of the gauntlet, a new threat emerged. Automated defense turrets descended from the ceiling, their barrels tracking the intruders. "Down!" Scott shouted, pulling Sirius behind a piece of debris as energy blasts scorched the air around them. Scott's combat instincts took over. He rolled from cover to cover, drawing the turret's fire while Sirius worked on another solution. Her eyes lit up as she spotted a disabled turret nearby. "Cover me," she called to Scott. As Scott provided a distraction, Sirius darted to the fallen turret. She pried open its control panel and began rewiring its systems. With a triumphant grin, she brought it back online, its barrel swiveling to target the other turrets. In a hail of energy blasts, their reprogrammed ally cleared a path to the control room. Scott and Sirius rushed forward, bursting through the doors to find Zorn hunched over a massive control console. The pirate captain's fingers danced over the controls, initiating the Stellar Forge's firing sequence. He turned to face them, a manic grin spreading across his scarred face. "You're too late," Zorn snarled. "Witness the dawn of a new era." Scott didn't waste time with words. He launched himself at Zorn, his fist connecting with the pirate's jaw. But Zorn barely flinched, his cybernetic enhancements absorbing the blow. As Scott and Zorn engaged in a brutal hand-to-hand fight, Sirius raced to the control console. Her eyes widened as she took in the alien technology, her mind working overtime to decipher its functions. The fight between Scott and Zorn was a blur of motion. Scott's trained reflexes were pushed to the limit as he faced an opponent enhanced beyond human capabilities. Zorn's cybernetic arm lashed out, catching Scott in the ribs and sending him crashing into a bank of computers. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," Zorn growled, advancing on Scott. "The galaxy is corrupt, weak. Only through fire can it be purified and rebuilt." Scott's eyes widened at the revelation. This wasn't just about power or greed. Zorn was a fanatic, driven by a twisted ideology. "You're insane," Scott spat, rolling to his feet and resuming his fighting stance. As the battle raged on, Sirius worked feverishly at the console. With a cry of triumph, she managed to halt the firing sequence. But her victory was short-lived. "Scott!" she called out, her voice tight with urgency. "I've stopped the firing, but Zorn's locked out the system. We need his handprint to fully deactivate it." Scott's tactics changed instantly. Instead of trying to defeat Zorn, he focused on immobilizing him. He feinted left, then dropped low, sweeping Zorn's legs out from under him. As Zorn fell, Scott pounced, using his body weight to pin the pirate captain down. But Zorn wasn't finished. With a snarl of defiance, he banged his head onto a hidden button on his belt. Alarms blared to life, and the facility began to shake. Zorn laughed maniacally. If I can't have the stellar forge, no one will. Sirius rushed over, grabbing Zorn's hand and pressing it to the console. The stellar forge powered down, but the base's self-destruct sequence continued unabated. "We need to get out of here," Sirius shouted over the din of collapsing equipment and blaring alarms. Scott delivered a final blow to Zorn, leaving him unconscious. Then he and Sirius sprinted for the exit, navigating through a maze of collapsing corridors and exploding equipment. Scott's strength came into play as he cleared fallen debris blocking their path. Sirius, drawing on her knowledge of the base's layout, guided them towards a potential escape route. As they reached the outer perimeter, they found their original entry points blocked by rubble and fire. Sirius's sharp eyes spotted a hangar in the distance. "There," she pointed. "If we can reach it, we might find a way out." They made a mad dash for the hangar, with Scott providing covering fire against the remaining pirate forces, who were also trying to escape the doomed base. Energy bolts sizzled past them as they ran, the heat of nearby explosions singeing their skin. They burst into the hangar to find a small spacecraft waiting. It was clearly of alien design, its sleek lines and pulsing lights, unlike anything they'd seen before. "Can you fly it?" Sirius asked as they clambered aboard. Scott slid into the pilot's seat, his hands hovering over the unfamiliar controls. "I guess we'll find out," he replied, his voice grim with persistence. As Scott worked to decipher the ship's flight systems, Sirius focused on bringing the engines online. The base around them continued to crumble, the self-destruct sequence reaching its final stages. With a lurch, the small craft lifted off, just as a massive explosion rocked the base. Scott gritted his teeth, his hands white-knuckled on the controls, as he navigated through a hail of debris and shockwaves. They broke atmosphere, the small ship shuddering under the strain. But their troubles were far from finished. Warning lights began to flash across the control panel, and the ship's systems started to fail. "We took damage in the escape," Sirius reported, her fingers dancing over the alien controls. "Life support is limited, and the communications array is down." As the adrenaline of their escape faded, Scott and Sirius found themselves drifting in the vastness of space, their task force nowhere in sight. In the sudden quiet, they turned to each other, the weight of their shared ordeal hanging between them. "We did it," Sirius said softly, her eyes meeting Scott's. Scott reached out, taking her hand in his. "We did," he replied, his voice filled with a mix of exhaustion and something deeper, more profound. For a moment, they simply sat there, the connection between them transcending words, transcending even the differences between their species. But their moment of peace was short-lived. A warning beacon flashed on the console, and Sirius leaned forward, her eyes widening. "Scott," she said, her voice tight with apprehension, "we've got company." Through the view screen, they watched as a massive warship materialized out of the darkness of space. It was like nothing they'd ever seen before, its design utterly alien and undeniably powerful. Before they could react, a shimmering beam of energy engulfed their small craft. The ship shuddered as it was drawn inexorably towards the looming alien vessel. Scott and Sirius shared a look of commitment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the alien ship engulfed them, they steeled themselves for the unknown, ready to confront whatever awaited them in the depths of this mysterious vessel. The ship shuddered as it was drawn inexorably towards the looming alien vessel. Scott and Sirius shared a look of commitment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the alien ship engulfed them, they steeled themselves for the unknown, ready to confront whatever awaited them in the depths of this mysterious craft. The tractor beam guided their small vessel into a cavernous hangar bay, its vast expanse dwarfing their craft. With a gentle thud, their ship settled on the deck. Scott and Sirius peered out the view screen, taking in the alien architecture surrounding them. The hangar walls pulsed with an otherworldly energy, and unfamiliar symbols adorned every surface. Suddenly, the hangar erupted with activity. A squad of heavily armed reptilian humanoids surrounded their ship, weapons trained on the entry hatch. Their scales gleamed under the harsh lighting, and their eyes, vertical slits of yellow, fixed unblinkingly on the craft. "Zarkai," Sirius whispered, recognition flashing in her eyes. "I've read about them in the diplomatic archives. Warrior race, strict code of honor. Scott nodded, his hand instinctively moving to where his weapon would be. Any advice? Be direct, show strength. They respect that. A deep, resonant voice boomed through their ship's communication system. Occupants of the unidentified vessel, exit immediately with your hands visible. Scott and Sirius exchanged a final glance before Scott activated the hatch release. As it hissed open, they stepped out onto the hangar deck, hands raised. The Zarkai soldiers tensed visibly at the sight of the interspecies pair. Murmurs rippled through their ranks, and their weapons wavered slightly. One Zarkai, his armor more ornate than the others, stepped forward. His posture radiated authority, and the others deferred to him immediately. I am Commander Krasiter, he announced, his voice a low growl. Identify yourselves and explain your presence in Zarkai space, as well as your involvement in the destruction we detected in this sector. Scott squared his shoulders, meeting the commander's gaze steadily. I'm Lieutenant Commander Scott Reynolds of the United Earth Fleet. This is Sirius, first diplomat of Bajor. We were on a mission to stop a dangerous criminal named Zorn from using a weapon called the Stellar Forge. Sirius picked up the thread seamlessly. The Stellar Forge had the potential to destroy entire star systems. We infiltrated Zorn's base, disabled the weapon, and narrowly escaped as the facility self-destructed. Krasner's eyes narrowed. You claim to have single-handedly thwarted a threat of that magnitude? We had no choice, Scott replied firmly. Millions of innocent lives were at stake. The commander studied them intently, his reptilian features unreadable. After a long moment, he nodded. Your actions, if true, are worthy of respect. However, the Zarkai High Council must hear of this. You will come with us. As they were led through the winding corridors of the Zarkai ship, Scott and Sirius took in every detail. The architecture was a blend of organic curves and sharp angles, with pulsing energy conduits lining the walls. Zarkai crew members stopped to stare as they passed, clearly unaccustomed to off-worlders aboard their vessel. They arrived at a massive set of doors, intricately carved with scenes of battle and cosmic phenomena. The doors swung open silently, revealing the Zarkai High Council chamber. The room was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow high above. Ornate pillars lined the walls, each depicting the exploits of Zarkai heroes. At the far end, a semicircular dais held the seats of the council members, each more imposing than the last. As Scott and Sirius were brought before the council, the interrogation began in earnest. Questions flew at them from all directions, probing every aspect of their mission and the threat they had neutralized. Scott answered with direct, unflinching honesty, his military bearing evident in every response. Sirius, drawing on her diplomatic training, added crucial context and nuance, painting a clear picture of the broader implications of Zorn's plans. As the questioning continued, a shift began to occur in the council's demeanor. Scott's straightforward responses and Warrior's composure seemed to resonate with the Zarkai sensibilities. Sirius's intelligence and tact were equally impressive, particularly when she demonstrated knowledge of obscure Zarkai customs. You are well informed for off-worlders, one council member noted, a hint of approval in his tone. Sirius inclined her head respectfully. The Bajorans believe that understanding is the first step towards peaceful coexistence. The council members conferred among themselves, their discussion too low for Scott and Sirius to hear. Finally, the central figure, clearly the head of the council, spoke. Your actions have inadvertently driven a significant threat to Zarkai interests. We have long battled against pirates and criminals in this sector, viewing it as our duty to protect those unable to defend themselves. For this reason, we are inclined to assist you in contacting your task force. A ripple of surprise passed through the chamber, but before Scott or Sirius could respond, another voice cut through the air. This is an outrage. All heads turned to see a Zarkai warrior striding forward, his armor bearing the marks of countless battles. His eyes blazed with fury as he pointed an accusatory finger at Scott and Sirius. I am War Chief Gexelar, and I say these off-worlders have no right to interfere in Zarkai space. They should be held as prisoners, not aided. The chamber erupted into chaos as council members argued back and forth. Commander Krastor stepped forward, facing Gexlar. You overstep, War Chief. The Council has made its decision. Gexlar's eyes narrowed dangerously. Then I invoke the right of Zarthos. Let combat decide this matter, as our ancestors decreed. A hush fell over the chamber. Krastor's fist tight, but he nodded solemnly. I accept your challenge, War Chief. May the strongest warrior prevail. As the Zarkai began preparations for the combat trial, Scott and Sirius were led away to holding cells. The sudden separation, after their intense shared experiences, left them both feeling off balance. Scott's cell was sparse, but not uncomfortable. He paced the small space, his mind racing with possibilities and strategies. A soft hiss announced the arrival of a visitor, and Scott turned to see an elderly Zarkai enter the cell. I am Vexcon, the old alien said, his voice a dry whisper. Keeper of the ancient prophecies, and you, Scott Reynolds, may be the key to a future long foretold. Meanwhile, in her own cell, Sirius studied every visible aspect of Zarkai technology and culture. Her keen mind began to form connections, building a theory about the Zarkai's true place in the galactic community. As the hour of the combat trial approached, Scott and Sirius were brought to the arena. The massive structure hummed with the energy of thousands of spectators. Across the sandy floor, they caught sight of each other. In that moment, without words, they communicated volumes. Their shared look spoke of tenacity, of trust, and of the unshakable bond forged through their trials. Whatever the outcome of this alien ritual, they would face it as they had faced every challenge, together. The crowd's roar grew deafening as Commander Krastor and War Chief Gexlar entered the arena, their weapons glinting in the harsh light. As the combatants took their positions, Scott and Sirius knew that the fate of their mission, their lives, and perhaps the future of human Bajoran-Zarkai relations hung in the balance. The arena fell silent as a gong sounded, signaling the start of the combat trial. With a fierce cry, Gexlar lunged forward, his blade flashing towards Krastor's throat. Krastor deflected the attack with a swift parry, his own blade singing through the air as he countered. The two Zarkai warriors moved with a fluid grace that belied their reptilian nature, their combat a deadly dance of flashing steel and precise footwork. Scott watched intently from his viewing platform, his trained eye picking apart every move. As the fight progressed, he noticed a pattern in Gexlar's attacks. The war chief favored his right side, leaving a subtle opening on his left flank. Glancing across the arena, Scott caught Sirius's eye. She stood on her own platform, her face a mask of concentration. He saw her gaze flick between the combatants and the arena's architecture, her mind clearly working on something beyond the immediate fight. Scott returned his attention to the duel. Krastor was holding his own, but Gexlar's aggressive style was slowly pushing him back. If the commander didn't exploit the weakness Scott had noticed, the tide of the battle could turn against him. Making a split-second decision, Scott began to signal discreetly. His hands moved in precise military gestures, hoping Krastor would notice without alerting Gexlar. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the commander was too focused on the fight to see. Then as Gexlar lunged forward with another powerful strike, Krastor's eyes flicked briefly to Scott. Understanding dawned on his face. In the next instant, he shifted his stance, angling his body to invite an attack on his right. Gexlar took the bait. As the war chief committed to a heavy overhead swing, Krastor pivoted. His blade flashed out, exploiting the opening on Gexlar's left. The tip of his weapon traced a line across the war chief's scales, drawing first blood. The crowd roared, the sound reverberating through the arena. Gexlar stumbled back, shock evident on his face. Krastor pressed his advantage, his movements now a fluid combination of attack and defense that kept his opponent off balance. As the momentum of the fight shifted, Scott's attention was drawn to Sirius. She was gesturing urgently, her eyes wide with excitement. Following her gaze, Scott noticed a series of intricate symbols carved into the arena's support pillars. They were similar to the markings he'd seen throughout the Zarkai ship, but these seemed older, more primal. Before he could ponder their significance, a collective gasp from the crowd pulled his focus back to the combat. Krastor had executed a brilliant feint, causing Gexelar to overextend. In a move too fast for Scott's eyes to follow, the commander disarmed his opponent, sending the war chief's weapon spinning across the arena floor. Gexelar fell to his knees, his chest heaving. Krastor stood over him, blade pointed at his throat. The arena fell silent, all eyes on the High Council. After a tense moment, the head counselor rose. The combat is concluded. Commander Krastor stands victorious. His decision to aid the off-worlders is upheld. The crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and angry shouts. Gexelar's supporters voiced their displeasure, but they were quickly silenced by the council's stern gaze. Scott and Sirius were escorted from their platforms to the arena floor. As they approached Krastor, Scott could see the toll the fight had taken on the commander. His scales were dulled with exertion, and a thin line of blood trickled from a cut above his eye. "Well fought," Scott said, extending his hand in a human gesture of respect. Krastor regarded the offered hand for a moment before clasping it firmly. "Your tactical insight was appreciated," he rumbled. Sirius stepped forward, her eyes shining with barely held back excitement. "Commander, council members, I've made a discovery that I believe is of utmost importance to your people." The head counselor leaned forward, intrigued. "Speak, Bjorn." Sirius launched into an explanation, her words tumbling out in a rush. She described the symbols she'd observed, linking them to fragments of Zarkai history she'd studied in the diplomatic archives. As she spoke, Scott could see the council members exchanging meaningful glances. "If I'm correct," Sirius concluded, "your species' isolation isn't a mandate, but a misinterpretation of an ancient edict meant to protect your culture, not segregate it." A murmur ran through the assembled Zarkai. The elderly Vexcon stepped forward, his frail form commanding immediate respect. "The off-worlder speaks truth," he announced, his voice carrying surprising strength. "This aligns with the prophecy I shared with Scott Reynolds. Our isolation has served its purpose, but the time for change is upon us." The council chamber erupted in discussion, but it was cut short by a piercing alarm. A young Zarkai officer burst into the arena, his scales pale with urgency. "High Council, long-range sensors have detected an incoming fleet," he reported. It's massive, unlike anything we've ever encountered." The head counselor's eyes narrowed. "Identify." The officer swallowed hard. "It appears to be a pirate armada, led by a ship of unknown design. They're hailing us. The leader identifies himself as Zorn." Scott and Sirius exchanged a look of shock. How had Zorn survived the base's destruction? And how had he amassed such a force so quickly? As if in answer to their unspoken questions, the officer continued. "The lead ship is utilizing technology that matches fragments we've detected from the weapon you described, the Stellar Forge." The implications hit Scott like a physical blow. Zorn had salvaged parts of the Stellar Forge. With that kind of power at his disposal, the pirate captain could wreak havoc on an unimaginable scale. The head counselor turned to Scott and Sirius, his expression grave. "It seems your mission is not yet complete. We find ourselves facing a threat beyond our experience. The question now is, do we face it alone, or do we embrace the change that fate has thrust upon us?" Scott stepped forward, his voice firm. "With respect, Counselor, this threat isn't just to the Zarkai. If Zorn has even a fraction of the Stellar Forge's power, he's a danger to the entire sector. We need to stand together." Sirius nodded, adding, "Our task force has experience dealing with Zorn. Combined with Zarkai's strength, we'd stand a much better chance of stopping him." The council members conferred in hushed tones. Scott could see the conflict on their faces. Centuries of isolation warring with the immediate threat before them. Finally, the head counselor spoke. "We will contact your task force. Commander Krastor, escort our allies to the communications array. We must prepare for battle." As they hurried through the corridors of the Zarkai ship, Scott's mind raced with tactical possibilities. Besides him, Sirius was already composing a diplomatic message to smooth the way for this unprecedented alliance. They reached the communications room, its banks of alien technology humming with energy. Scott took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation to come. As Krastor input the necessary codes to breach Zarkai communication isolation, Scott and Sirius exchanged a look of perseverance. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Humans, Bajorans, and Zarkai united against a common foe. The fate of the sector hung in the balance, and the next few moments would determine whether they stood a chance against Zorn's revenge. The communication array crackled to life, and a familiar voice filled the room. "This is Admiral Adams of the United Earth Fleet. Identify yourself." Scott leaned forward, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Admiral, this is Lieutenant Commander Scott Reynolds. We've got one hell of a situation here, sir. And we need immediate reinforcements." Admiral Adams's voice crackled with static, but his tone remained steady. "Understood, Commander. We've detected unusual energy signatures in your vicinity. What's your status?" Scott quickly briefed the Admiral on the Zarkai Alliance and Zorn's approaching armada. As he spoke, Sirius worked with Krastor to patch in visual data from the Zarkai long-range sensors. "By the stars," Adams breathed as the image of Zorn's fleet filled the screen. "We're en route, Commander. Hold the line until we arrive." The communication cut off, leaving an uneasy silence in the room. Scott turned to Krastor, his expression grim. "We need to prepare for battle. How quickly can we mobilize your forces?" Krastor's eyes narrowed, a predatory glint in their depths. "The Zarkai are always ready for war, human. Our fleet stands prepared." Within minutes, Scott, Sirius, and Krastor stood on the bridge of the Zarkai flagship. The view screen before them displayed a sea of stars, soon to be filled with the approaching pirate armada. Sirius worked furiously at a console, her fingers flying over the alien controls. "I'm coordinating with the Bajoran ships," she reported. "We're integrating our sensor data with the Zarkai systems." Scott nodded, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. "Good. We'll need every advantage we can get." A low hum filled the bridge as the Zarkai ships powered up their weapons. Krastor barked orders in his native tongue, his crew responding with practiced efficiency. Suddenly, the void of space lit up as thousands of pirate vessels dropped out of hyperspace. The sheer scale of Zorn's fleet was staggering, dwarfing the Allied forces. "By the prophets," Sirius whispered, her eyes wide. Before Scott could respond, the pirate fleet opened fire. A barrage of energy weapons, powered by the salvaged Stellar Forge technology, lanced across space. Several Allied ships, caught off guard by the raw power of the attack, were instantly disabled. "Evasive maneuvers!" Krastor roared. The Zarkai flagship shuddered as it banked hard, narrowly avoiding a devastating hit. Scott's mind raced, analyzing the pirate formation. His eyes darted across the tactical display, searching for a weakness. There, a gap in their flank, barely noticeable, but potentially exploitable. "Commander," Scott called out, pointing to the display. "If we hit them here with a fast attack squadron, we could disrupt their formation." Krastor studied the display, his reptilian features unreadable. After a moment, he nodded. "Do it." Scott turned to Sirius, their eyes meeting in a silent exchange. She nodded, understanding passing between them without words. "I'll lead the squadron," Scott said, already moving towards the exit. "Scott!" Sirius called after him. He paused, looking back. "Be careful." He gave her a quick nod, then sprinted towards the hangar bay. Minutes later, Scott found himself at the controls of a Zarkai fighter. The alien craft responded to his touch with surprising sensitivity. A squadron of Zarkai pilots flanked him, their voices calm and professional in his earpiece. "All units, form up on me," Scott ordered. "We're going to hit them hard and fast. Aim for their power relays and weapon systems." The squadron of fighters streaked across space, weaving through the chaos of the larger battle. Scott's hands danced across the controls, pushing the Zarkai craft to its limits. They approached the pirate fleet's flank, unnoticed in the frenzy of the main engagement. "Now!" Scott shouted. The squadron split apart, each fighter selecting a target. Scott dove towards a massive pirate cruiser, his weapons primed. He fired, watching with grim satisfaction as his shots punched through the ship's shields and tore into its hull. Explosions blossomed across the pirate fleet's flank as the other fighters struck their targets. Scott's strategy was working. The pirate formation began to falter, creating openings for the main Allied fleet to exploit. Back on the Zarkai flagship, Sirius coordinated with the Bajoran contingent. "If we harmonize our shield frequencies," she explained rapidly, "we can increase our overall defensive capability." Krastor listened intently, then nodded his approval. Sirius's fingers flew over the console, implementing the changes. The effect was immediate. The next barrage from the pirate fleet washed over the Allied ships with noticeably less impact. Just as the tide seemed to be turning, a new threat emerged. A massive energy field began to spread from Zorn's command ship, engulfing Allied vessels in its path. Ships caught in the field began to lose power, their systems failing. "It's draining our energy," Sirius realized, her mind racing. She studied the readings, drawing on her knowledge of Bajoran energy manipulation and her recent study of Zarkai technology. An idea formed, risky but potentially game-changing. "Commander," she called to Krastor, "if we remodulate our power cores, we might be able to create a feedback loop. It could overload their energy-draining field." Krastor's eyes narrowed as he considered the proposal. "The risk?" "High," Sirius admitted, "but if it works, it could turn the tide of the battle." The Zarkai commander was silent for a moment, then nodded sharply. "Do it." As Sirius began working with the engineering teams to implement her plan, Scott's voice came over the comm. "This is Reynolds. We've located one of Zorn's command ships, requesting permission to board and disable it from the inside." Krastor's mandibles clicked in what might have been approval. "Granted, human. Show them the fury of our alliance." Scott acknowledged the order, then cut the transmission. He turned to his squadron, his expression resolute. "All right, team. We're going in hot. Be ready for anything." The Zarkai fighters streaked towards the massive pirate vessel, dodging enemy fire and debris. As they approached, Scott could see the ship's hull was a patchwork of alien technologies, a monstrous hybrid of stolen innovations. "Brace for impact," Scott warned as they aimed for a docking bay. The fighters crashed through the bay's shields, skidding to a halt on the deck. Scott was out of his cockpit in seconds, blaster in hand. The Zarkai pilots followed suit, their own weapons at the ready. As they advanced into the ship, they encountered fierce resistance. The pirate crew was a motley assortment of species, many sporting crude cybernetic enhancements. Scott's human adaptability and combat experience proved crucial as they fought through the unfamiliar corridors. "We need to reach the bridge," Scott shouted over the din of battle. "That's where we'll find the ship's main controls, and possibly Zorn himself." As they fought their way deeper into the ship, Scott couldn't help but wonder how Sirius was faring. Back on the Zarkai flagship, the fate of the entire sector might well rest on her plan to counteract the energy-draining field. Little did he know that at that very moment, Sirius was facing a crisis of her own. A group of pirate saboteurs had somehow infiltrated the Zarkai flagship, threatening to undermine their efforts from within. The battle raged on multiple fronts, in the vastness of space, within the corridors of Zorn's command ship, and on the Zarkai flagship itself. The outcome remained uncertain, with the fate of all hanging in the balance. Balance. Scott's heart raced as he fought his way through the corridors of Zorn's command ship, the structure groaning and shuddering around him. Alarms blared, red emergency lights casting an eerie glow over the chaos. "Scott, can you hear me?" Sirius's voice crackled through his comlink. "The ship's breaking apart. You need to get out of there." "I'm trying," Scott grunted, wincing as he favored his injured side. A stray blast during the boarding action had caught him off guard, and now every step sent a jolt of pain through his body. "Any suggestions on an exit strategy?" "Working on it," Sirius replied, her voice tense with concentration. "There's a maintenance shaft about 20 meters ahead on your left. It should lead you towards the outer hull." Scott pushed forward, his blaster at the ready. The ship lurched violently, nearly throwing him off his feet. He stumbled, catching himself against a bulkhead, just as a massive explosion rocked the vessel. The comlink erupted in a burst of static, then went dead. "Sirius? Sirius!" Scott called out, but there was no response. The silence in his ear was deafening. With no time to dwell on the lost connection, Scott spotted the maintenance shaft Sirius had mentioned. The hatch was sealed tight, but Scott wasn't about to let that stop him. He pulled out his combat knife, jamming it into the seam of the hatch and using it as a makeshift lever. The hatch creaked open, revealing a narrow passage beyond. Scott didn't hesitate, squeezing into the tight space as another explosion shook the ship. He crawled through the shaft, ignoring the burning in his lungs and the throbbing pain in his side. Back on the Zarkai flagship, Sirius stared at the static-filled screen in horror. "We've lost contact," she reported, her voice tight with worry. Krastor's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. "The human ship is breaking apart. He will not survive much longer." Sirius whirled to face the Zarkai commander, her eyes blazing with grit. "We have to get closer. Our sensors might be able to pick up his life signs if we're in range." "It is too dangerous," Krastor growled. "We risk our own ship in the attempt." "Please," Sirius implored, her voice barely above a whisper. "He risked everything to save me. We can't abandon him now." Krastor studied her for a long moment, then nodded sharply. "Very well. Helm, bring us closer to the pirate vessel. Weapons, stand ready to defend against debris." The Zarkai flagship moved with surprising grace for its size, closing the distance to the disintegrating pirate command ship. Sirius's fingers flew over the sensor controls, her eyes scanning for any sign of Scott. "There!" she exclaimed, pointing to a faint blip on the screen. "He's made it to a hangar bay on the ship's port side." Inside the pirate vessel, Scott emerged from the maintenance shaft, his uniform torn and covered in grime. The hangar bay was a scene of destruction, debris scattered across the deck and fires burning unchecked. In the center of the chaos stood a single fighter craft, damaged but potentially flyable. Scott limped toward the ship, his pilot's instincts kicking in as he assessed its condition. The craft was alien in design, a hodgepodge of stolen technology, but the basics were universal. He clambered into the cockpit, his hands moving over the controls with practiced ease. The ship's systems flickered to life, but a quick glance showed Scott that the hangar bay doors were sealed shut. With no time for finesse, he targeted the doors with the fighter's weapons and opened fire. The blast tore through the weakened structure, creating an opening to space. Scott gunned the engines, rocketing out of the hangar just as a massive explosion tore through the pirate command ship. The force of the blast caught the fighter, sending it tumbling end over end through space. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit as system after system failed. Scott fought with the controls, trying to stabilize the craft as he watched his life support levels plummet. Through the spinning view screen, he caught glimpses of the battle raging around him, and then a familiar shape growing larger. The Zarkai flagship loomed before him, positioned with impossible precision. Scott felt a sudden jolt as a tractor beam locked onto his failing craft, pulling him to safety mere moments before the fighter's life support gave out completely. As the crippled ship was drawn into the Zarkai hangar bay, Scott's vision began to blur. He was vaguely aware of the sound of running feet, of voices shouting in alien languages. Then, a familiar face swam into view. "Scott!" Sirius cried, her hands reaching for him as the fighter's cockpit was wrenched open. He managed a weak smile as he fumbled with his restraints. "Took you long enough," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. Sirius helped him from the cockpit, supporting his weight as his legs threatened to give out. Their eyes met, and in that moment, all the unspoken feelings between them came rushing to the surface. Without hesitation, Sirius pulled Scott close and kissed him deeply. The hangar bay faded away, the sounds of the battle becoming distant as they lost themselves in the kiss. When they finally parted, both were breathless, their eyes shining with a mixture of relief and newfound understanding. "I thought I'd lost you," Sirius whispered, her forehead resting against Scott's. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Not a chance. We make too good a team." Their moment was interrupted by Krastor's gruff voice. "The pirate fleet is in disarray. Our victory is at hand." Scott and Sirius turned to see the Zarkai commander watching them, his expression unreadable. Around them, the hangar bay was a flurry of activity as fighters launched to mop up the remaining enemy forces. We should get to the bridge, Scott said, straightening up despite his injuries. There's still work to be done. Sirius nodded, supporting Scott as they made their way towards the nearest turbolift. As the doors closed behind them, she squeezed his hand, a silent promise passing between them. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The lift hummed as it carried them towards the bridge, where the final acts of this battle, and the first steps towards a new future, awaited them. The galaxy had changed irrevocably in the span of a few short days, and Scott and Sirius found themselves at the heart of it all, their unlikely partnership now the key to shaping what was to come.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.